The Duke couldn't look away when the poor girl danced alone. Before you lose yourself in this story, if you've ever felt invisible in a world that wasn't made for you, this one is for you. Subscribe and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The letter arrived on a Tuesday, sealed with black wax and the crest of a man Cecily Ashworth had never expected to hear from again. She stood in the narrow hallway of the cottage. The salt wind pressed against the door as if trying to get inside. She read the letter twice, then a third time. The words did not change. They remained what they were, cold, absolute, and without warmth. You will present yourself at Ashworth Cottage on Friday at 2 o'clock. The matter is one of mutual benefit. Come alone, no greeting, no signature, only the crest of Blackmore. She set the letter on the kitchen table, beside her mother's untouched broth, and pressed both palms flat against the wood. The grain was rough beneath her fingers, worn smooth only at the edges, where her mother had kneaded bread for 20 years. The cottage smelled of damp wool and the lavender her mother kept in a cracked pot on the windowsill, the last small luxury they allowed themselves. From the room beyond the thin wall, she could hear her mother's breathing. Slow. Too shallow for a woman who had once laughed so loud the neighbors knocked to ask if everything was all right. The physician had used words like deterioration and winter months and careful management, words that cost money, words that cost more than a rector's daughter had. Cecily folded the letter, put it in her apron pocket, and began to prepare for Friday. She spent the intervening days in a strange suspension, the kind that settles on a person who has received news that cannot be processed until it becomes real. She changed her mother's linens. She walked to the village for bread and cod and a small block of coal. She sat in the evenings mending by the fire while her mother slept, listening to the Atlantic dismantle itself against the cliffs below, and tried to build, in her mind, a version of Friday that did not cost her more than she could afford to pay. She could not quite construct it. The Duke of Blackmore was not a man she knew. He was a fact she had encountered briefly, at the edge of the worst thing that had happened in her county in a generation. 3 years ago, a girl, beautiful, unhappy, too trusting, had come to ruin in the village. The Duke's sister, Elodie, and Cecily, who had been quietly present in the way that daughters of rectors are always present at the edges of other people's catastrophes, had seen enough. Not everything, but enough. He had known it then. Apparently he knew it still. Friday arrived with a cold, clear sky and the smell of coming rain. He arrived at 2 o'clock exactly. She heard the carriage before she saw it, iron wheels on the coastal lane, too heavy, too certain, out of place in the modest rhythm of this road. She stood at the window and watched the Duke of Blackmore descend without assistance. He straightened the cuffs of his coat with 2 brief, efficient movements. He did not look at the cottage the way visitors usually did, with that familiar mix of pity and discomfort. He looked at it the way a man looks at a problem he has already solved. Cecily opened the door before he knocked. For a moment they simply regarded one another across the threshold. She had seen him before, twice, 3 years ago, at the edges of the tragedy. He had been formidable then. He was more so now. Tall, lean, with mahogany hair and eyes the color of aged whiskey. The kind of man who carried authority the way other men carried a coat, as though he'd been born wearing it. And yet, she noticed, because she noticed everything, it was the one inheritance her father had left her, that there was something compressed about him, something behind the formidable surface that had the quality of a bruise, old, deep, and carefully never touched. Miss Ashworth. His voice was exactly as she remembered, a baritone stripped of warmth, but not of power. Your Grace. She stepped back. Please come in. He entered, filling the low-ceilinged room in a way that had nothing to do with his height. His gaze moved once across the space, the worn furniture, the medical bottles on the shelf, the single candle burning because the window light was insufficient, the absence of anything not strictly necessary. Then it returned to her face without comment, but she had seen his jaw tighten just briefly. She did not offer tea. She sat. He remained standing. I will be direct. I would prefer it, she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, more like the recalibration of a man who had expected to be managing someone already frightened. My aunt, Lady Eugenia Devereux, requires a companion for the Brighton season. She is 71, sharp-minded, and has dismissed 4 companions in as many months. She requires composure, discretion, and the intelligence not to be patronizing about it. Cecily waited. I require, he continued, and here his voice dropped by a fraction, acquiring an edge that was almost private, someone who will ensure that certain matters, pertaining to events 3 years past in this county, remain exactly where they are. Buried. The fire in the grate settled. A log shifted. You think my presence in your aunt's household constitutes a risk, she said. I think your absence from a position of security constitutes a greater one. You are known to me, known to the events in question. Closer observation is preferable to the uncertainty of your independent circumstance. He was not wrong. That was the terrible thing. She had been making her own version of that calculation for 3 years. The difference was that hers had never resolved. His had, at her expense. She felt it, briefly, a sharp flare in her chest, not quite anger. More like the indignation of a person who has been accurately assessed and resents how little effort it required. And my mother, she said. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. He set it on the table between them, not handed it, set it the way one places a contract before a party who has no real choice. A quarterly annuity, sufficient for a physician's visits, winter fuel, and the management of this property. Conditional upon your service to my aunt and your continued discretion. Cecily looked at the document without touching it. She thought of her mother's breathing, the shallow sound of it in the dark, the physician's careful, costly words. She thought of the spinet in the corner, silent now, 2 keys warped by damp, no money for a tuner, her mother unable to sit at it regardless. She thought of the lavender in the cracked pot. She picked up the document, read it, every clause, every condition. He waited, not impatiently, with the stillness of a man accustomed to having documents read in full. Then she looked up at him. For just 1 second she let him see that she was not afraid, that she understood exactly what this was, that she was choosing it, not because he had cornered her, but because the alternative was watching her mother diminish while she held her principles like flowers in a closed fist. I will require Sundays, she said. His jaw tightened fractionally. Granted. And you will not use my mother's health as a lever in any future disagreement. A long pause. The fire crackled. Rain began against the window, soft and steady. Agreed. Furthermore, she said, I will serve your aunt honestly and well, not because of this contract, because that is the only way I know how to do anything. He looked at her for a moment that lasted longer than 2 seconds. That quality, he said, is exactly why you are here. She folded the document, placed it in her apron pocket. 2 pieces of paper that had in the space of a week rearranged her life. Then I will present myself in Brighton on Monday next, Your Grace. A single nod. He turned to leave. At the door, he paused without turning. You should know that my aunt is in fact delightful. The companions she dismissed were sycophants. She has no patience for performance. Neither do I, Cecily said. He left. She stood at the window and watched the carriage disappear, and did not allow herself to feel anything at all until the sound of the wheels was entirely gone. Then she went to sit with her mother, took her hand, and told her the lie that was also the truth, that everything was going to be all right. Her mother squeezed her fingers, too weak to ask questions, but her eyes, still sharp, still entirely her mother's, held Cecily's for a long moment and said without words, I know what this costs you, don't think I don't know. Cecily smiled until she believed it herself. Then she began to pack. Brighton arrived like a painting Cecily had only ever seen described in books, white-fronted terraces, sea light, and the ceaseless roar of the Channel. The salt air hit her as she stepped from the hired coach, sharp and clean. It scrubbed away the cottage smell of damp stone and medicine. She stood for a moment on the pavement with her worn trunk at her feet and breathed it in. The sky was a broad, confident blue. The street moved with the self-assured energy of people who had arrived here by choice. She picked up the trunk, went inside, Lady Eugenia Devereux was nothing like what Cecily had expected. She sat in a high-backed chair by the window, with a book of botanical illustrations open on her lap, reading spectacles perched at the end of her nose. She looked up when Cecily entered, not with the assessing scrutiny of a woman of her station receiving an inferior, but with the bright, uncomplicated interest of someone who had simply been waiting to see what arrived. "Sit down," she said without preamble. "I cannot bear people who hover." Cecily sat. "You don't fidget," Lady Eugenia observed, with the satisfaction of a naturalist recording a promising find. The last one fidgeted constantly, like a bird in a chimney. She turned a page. "Can you read aloud without turning everything into a performance?" "I believe so, my lady." "Can you tolerate conchology?" "I have an extensive collection." The last companion called the shells quaint. I dismissed her on the spot. "I find them architecturally interesting," Cecily said honestly. "The geometry of a nautilus is rather extraordinary." Lady Eugenia looked up properly then, over the spectacles, a long, measuring look, the kind that takes in not just what you say but how you breathe while you're saying it. Then the corner of her mouth lifted. "My nephew tells me you are discreet. I hope he also told you that I am not stupid." "He did not need to, my lady, it is apparent." "Good." She returned to her illustrations with the air of someone filing away a satisfactory conclusion. "You'll have the blue room. Dinner is at 7. My nephew joins us when he is in residence, which is more often than suits either of us. But there it is. He is a great deal of trouble, as I imagine you know." She paused. "Do not be frightened of him. He performs severity because he has forgotten how to perform anything else. It is rather sad when one considers what he was before." "Before?" Cecily asked carefully. Lady Eugenia looked at her over the spectacles. "Before his sister died," she said simply. "He laughed once. I find it best to remember that." She closed the book. "You may go. And Miss Ashworth, welcome." The blue room was small. It faced the garden and smelled of beeswax and old roses. Cecily set her trunk at the foot of the bed. The mattress was better than anything she had slept on in 3 years, and sat. The ceiling was white and even. Through the window, a single late rose clung to the garden wall, the color of old wine. She had arrived. She was here. The contract was real, and she would do what was required. Sebastian arrived 3 days later. She heard him before she saw him. A house rearranges itself around certain people. Servants move with more purpose. Voices recalibrate to a slightly more careful register. Then his voice in the entrance hall, the cool, controlled baritone, asking about the post as though the post had better have arranged itself correctly. She was in the drawing room arranging hothouse flowers when he appeared in the doorway. She heard him stop, a small, distinct pause, before he spoke. "Miss Ashworth, I trust you have settled in." "Quite comfortably, thank you, Your Grace." His gaze moved once across the arrangement she had sorted by height without being told to, and returned to her face. "My aunt is pleased with you." "I am glad to hear it." "It was not an empty report," he said, as though she had implied it might be. "She is not a woman who is easily pleased. If she says it, she means it." A pause. "You will dine with us this evening." He left. She turned back to the flowers and became aware, with some irritation, that her pulse was elevated, not from fear, from the distinct alertness of being in a room with someone whose attention, however briefly directed, had the quality of a lens. Focused, exacting, and warming. She trimmed a stem harder than necessary. Told herself it meant nothing. Dinner was the beginning of their education in one another. Lady Eugenia talked gloriously tangentially about naval history and Arctic terns and the deplorable state of modern embroidery, and Cecily listened and responded, and made the elderly lady laugh twice. The second time loudly enough that Sebastian set down his wine-glass and looked across the table. Not with surprise exactly, with something she could not immediately name. He said little himself, ate with unhurried precision, but his attention moved across the table like something that had decided to be there, quiet, steady, thorough. Once, she made a small observation about the tides. Only a sentence. He went entirely still for a fraction of a second. Not visibly, but she caught it. The way you catch the change in a room's air before a door opens. She walked back to the blue room afterwards, with the feeling of having passed a test she had not known she was taking, and the uncomfortable awareness that she had found it interesting. The drawing room of Lady Eugenia's villa was a sunlit cage. Cecily had learned its dimensions well. A fortnight in Brighton, she had read Fordyce's sermons aloud with appropriate gravity, arranged shawls against drafts that Lady Eugenia then rearranged herself, poured tea with a steadiness that masked the constant low hum of awareness. Sebastian somewhere in the house. He appeared at odd hours, at the mantel, at the window, in doorways, watching her with the curious, faintly irritated attention of a man trying to solve a problem he had not agreed to find interesting. That afternoon, Lady Eugenia dispatched them on a walk along the Stein. It was not a suggestion. They walked in silence, a careful foot of space between them. The gulls screamed at the indifferent sky. The channel was grey-green and vast, and the wind off it carried salt and distance. "You are managing the role adequately," he said, not looking at her. "Adequacy is my aim, Your Grace. One does not wish to be remarkable." "Yet you are," he said, and the words escaped him, bypassing whatever gate he usually kept between thought and speech. He stopped, facing the water. His profile was clean and stern against the sky. "My aunt finds you refreshingly genuine. That is not a compliment she distributes freely." Cecily looked at him. The anguish was there, not on the surface where he would have managed it into nothing, but pressed into the slight tension at the corner of his mouth, into the way his eyes looked not at the sea, but through it, into some private and lightless room he had been occupying alone for years. "She is kindness itself," Cecily said softly. "It is not difficult to be grateful for genuine kindness." He turned. His gaze caught hers. "Is that what you are doing? Playing a part? Are we not both, Your Grace?" A long, salt-scoured silence. The world contracted to the space between them. The cool detachment in his expression flickered, just briefly, and underneath it she saw something hotter, more turbulent. Then the shutter came down again. "Yes," he said. The word was rough, abraded. "We are." They walked on. The tension between them had changed quality, no longer merely the wariness of two people bound by an uncomfortable contract, something more alive, more awake. As they passed a public garden where a regimental band packed their instruments, a loose sheet of music skittered across the path in the wind and came to rest against Cecily's shoe. She bent and picked it up. A simple country air, light and undemanding. The melody was already forming in her mind before she consciously read the notes. Without thinking, her fingers traced it in the air before her. A faint hum escaped her throat. She did not notice until he spoke. "You read music." His voice was close. He had stepped in to look at the sheet. She folded it quickly, tucked it into her reticule. "A little, it is of no consequence. My sister played," he said, and the words were torn from him rather than offered. He stiffened the instant they escaped. The shutters came down over his face with a speed that almost hurt to watch. But she had already seen what lay beneath them. The naked, devastating grief. The core of him, exposed for one searing second. It was so recognizable, so exactly the shape of her own interior loss, that her throat constricted. "Your Grace, we should return." His voice was cold, the intimate register sealed away as if it had never existed. "My aunt will be expecting us." The afternoon closed over them like water over a stone. After dinner, as Lady Eugenia dozed by the fire with her illustrations sliding slowly from her lap, a restless energy drove Cecily from the drawing room. She could not sit still. The walk, the wind, the fragment of grief she had glimpsed on his face, it had all accumulated into something she could not discharge by sitting in an armchair. She found herself outside the music room, her hand on the door. The smell of old ivory and dust and the silence of instruments left unplayed for too long. She pushed the door open. The room was dark. Moonlight poured through the tall window like water over stone, silver and still. She did not light the candles. There was something in that uninhabited dark that felt, for the first time since she had arrived in this careful, contracted life, like it was made for her. For the girl from Cornwall who had never owned a ballroom, only a muddy yard, a mother who hummed while hanging the washing, and a spinet with 2 warped keys that made certain chords impossible and all the others more dear. She had no intention of dancing, but her fingers found the melody from memory, the country air from the Stein, and before her better judgment could close its fist around the impulse, her feet moved. It was not a waltz. There was no partner, no protocol, no weight of watchful eyes recording her deficiencies. There was only her, turning slowly in the silver dark, her arms lifted slightly as though embracing the air. The loose curls at her nape caught the moonlight. The hem of her muslin whispered against the floorboards, a sound like a secret being told very quietly. She hummed. Her eyes went half-closed. The moonlight lay across her shoulders like a shawl. For one perfect stolen moment she was not Miss Ashworth, the woman of reduced circumstance, the instrument of a duke's peace of mind. She was simply Cecily, just herself, just alive, in a darkened room, in a body that knew how to move to music even when there was none. Sebastian stopped in the corridor. He had left his study to retrieve a document from the library. That was the rational explanation, true and entirely beside the point. His steps had ceased before he understood the room was occupied. He stood in the doorway, one hand on the handle, the other at his side. He could not move. She did not know she was being watched. That was what stopped his breath. There was no performance in her, not a grain of it, none of the managed, constructed presentation of a person fulfilling a role. There was only her, this woman he had categorized as a necessary measure, a variable to be managed, dancing for no one, in a darkened room. For the uncomplicated reason that the music was in her, and she had a moment alone in which to let it out. The grace of it was unguarded. That was what undid him. Not the movement itself, the quality of it, the absolute absence of an audience in her mind. He had watched women dance in every ballroom in London. He had never watched anyone move like they were alone in the world and glad of it. "Who are you?" he thought, breathless, the words moving through him like a resonant note that goes on long after the key is released. "That you dance alone as though the whole world might hear?" He stepped back into the corridor before she turned, made no sound. He stood against the wall and waited until his breathing was even, then returned to his study. He stood at the window looking at the dark garden below. His hands, he noticed, were not entirely steady. He pressed them flat against the desk, feeling the cool solidity of the wood, and acknowledged, with the cold clarity he applied to everything, that something had shifted in him without his consent. He noted it, the way you note a change in the weather. Cecily, unaware, let the dance end naturally. She caught her breath, smiled at herself for the indulgence, and lit the candles. The pianoforte waited. She sat, lifted the full-board, pressed a single key. The note hung in the dusty air, pure and resonant. She retrieved the sheet from her reticule. Her fingers found the pattern, clumsy at first, then steadier. The melody filled the room, carrying something of green fields and hearth smoke into this elegant, cold space. She closed her eyes. She did not hear the door open. The silence that followed her final note was different, inhabited. Her eyes flew open. Sebastian stood inside the threshold. He had removed his coat. His waistcoat was unbuttoned, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, as if he had abandoned something physical without finishing it. The candlelight carved his face into planes and shadows. The sternness had softened into something raw and undefended. He looked like a man returned from somewhere very far away, not yet accustomed to the light. His amber eyes moved across her, the escaped curls, the wide eyes in the candle glow, the simple muslin gown, with an attention that was not assessment, was not management, was recognition. "Do not stop," he said. His voice was a low scrape, something drawn from deeper than his usual register. Every instinct told her to stand, to rebuild the careful distance, but the unguarded quality of his expression held her in place. "It is only a country air. Play it." Not a command. Something more exposed than that. She began again. The notes trembled under his silent observation. She felt his attention like a physical thing, fixed on her hands, then slowly rising to her face. When she finished, the quiet was absolute. He moved. 3 strides. He stood beside the instrument. He looked at the worn sheet, then at her. Then, without a word, he sat on the bench. The space between them was negligible. The warmth of his proximity and the scent of sandalwood and night air pressed against her senses. He drew a breath that seemed to cost him something real. His hands settled over the keys. He began to play. It was the same air, and nothing like it. Under his hands, the melody became a haunting elegy. Each chord a raw confession, not performance, private torment given sound, the music pouring from him the way blood moves from a reopened wound. Unstoppable, and a relief, and terrible. Cecily sat with her lungs tight, her hand clenched in her lap against the impulse to reach toward that bowed shoulder, and listen to a man tell the truth about his grief in the only language he had left for it. The final chord lingered, dissolved. He did not move, head bowed, fingers still against the ivory. The mantel clock ticked. A night bird called once outside and was answered by silence. Slowly he turned. The citadel in his eyes was gone. What replaced it was turbulent and searching and painfully real. The gaze of a man who has just heard himself speak and cannot take it back. "You traced the air," he said, his voice scraped raw, "while you played, earlier today on the Stein." She flushed. "A foolish habit. Forgive me." "No." The word came out almost urgent. He took one step closer. Sandalwood and night air wrapped around the small space between them. It was without artifice. "Your playing," she said, courage rising like a tide, "was not adequate. It was a truth." A muscle moved in his jaw. "Truths are luxuries men like me cannot afford, Miss Ashworth." He said her name like he was testing its weight. "They destroy, as you well know." "Some silences are prisons, Your Grace," she whispered. Something ignited in his expression, brief, devastating. His gaze dropped to her mouth just for an instant before he stepped back. Stone by stone, the wall rebuilt itself. "Prisons of our own making are the only ones we deserve," he said. His voice was restored to its exacting register, though it rang hollow in the candlelit room. "You will accompany my aunt to the library tomorrow at 11. Good night, Miss Ashworth." He left. She stood among the guttering candles and pressed one hand to her sternum, where his music was still vibrating, and understood that she was in considerably more trouble than the contract had ever specified. The terrace of the villa faced west. In the late afternoons, it held the light like a cupped hand, golden, slow, reluctant to go. Cecily had taken to sitting there between her duties, with a book that rarely got read, grateful for the brief illusion of solitude. She was there on the third afternoon after the music room, when she heard his footsteps on the flagstones. She knew the sound of them now. Measured and deliberate, the step of a man who chooses his ground the way he chooses his words, for control. He had come from a ride, dust on his boots, a restlessness in his shoulders that the exercise had not resolved. He told her his aunt required her. He did not, however, leave. He moved to the stone balustrade and stood with his back to her, facing the walled garden. Below them the late roses clung stubbornly to the wall, a deep and fading red. Salt air came over the rooftops, carrying the smell of seasons turning. "Do you dance, Miss Ashworth?" he asked it without turning, the careful tone of a man who has been considering a question longer than he intends to reveal. "At harvest homes in Cornwall, or has your circumstance reserved music only for the pleasure of others?" She felt the weight of it, its specificity. He was not making conversation. "I have danced," she said, "though not as society defines it. There is little call for the quadrille in a fisherman's village." "A waltz requires only a clear floor," he said, "and a certain abandonment." He paused. The word hung strangely in his mouth. "My sister believed that music was a corpse without motion. She would dance at home when she thought herself unobserved." He stopped. A tendon moved in his neck. "There is a singular liberty in movement meant for no audience, an act of complete privacy. Would you not agree?" Cecily's pulse was loud in her throat. He was speaking of Elodie, aloud, to her, and he was doing it looking at the roses, at the sky, anywhere but directly at her. The way people speak the truest things slightly sideways, because saying them head-on would make them too real to survive. "I would," she said softly. To dance alone is to make a sanctuary of a moment, a place that belongs to no one else. It is an act of quiet courage. He turned then, fully, and looked at her, not as a variable, not as a problem to be managed, as a person who had just given language to something he had been trying to name for 3 years. Precisely, he said. The word barely carried, but it arrived. From the drawing-room window came Lady Eugenia's voice, magnificent in its impatience. Cecily, the Conus Gloria Maris awaits its provenance, and I am not getting younger. The moment cracked along its edges. Sebastian's expression shuttered. He straightened. You are required. She moved to pass him. The dark wool of his sleeve brushed her muslin, barely, incidentally, the merest nearness of fabric against fabric. He had not moved to create it. It simply happened, in the small physics of 2 people on a narrow terrace. But she felt it the rest of the afternoon, in that exact spot on her arm, like a small warm signature that did not fade. That evening, a sealed note arrived on her dressing table. The Blackmore crest in black wax. Inside, no letter, only the worn sheet of music, the country air from the Stein. And in the margin, in a bold, slashing hand, nothing like his controlled correspondence. For the brave. She held it for a long time. Then she folded it with care and placed it inside the cover of her book, like something pressed to be kept. Evidence of a man who communicated in music and margins, because direct speech had become, for him, too costly. She lay in the dark of the blue room and listened to the sea. She did not pretend to herself that what was growing in her chest was manageable. She only hoped it was wise enough to wait. Lord Crispin Carrington arrived on a Wednesday, uninvited, trailing bergamot and calculation. Cecily had been cataloguing the shells with Lady Eugenia, the Murex ramosus with its violent spines, the pearlescent haliotis that caught the light like the inside of a secret, when the butler announced him. She registered Sebastian's posture change before she registered the name. Every line of him went to stone. Carrington was handsome, in the manner of things maintained past their natural season. The bloom still present, but applied now by effort rather than nature. His smile arrived before his eyes caught up with it. When those eyes settled on Cecily, they moved over her with the calculating attention of a man who is not admiring, but appraising. Ashworth, he said, tasting the name. Cornish, I believe. Yes, my lord. One hears things. He turned back to Sebastian with the ease of a man who has been steering conversations for years. You've been quite secluded this season, Blackmore. Tucked away in Brighton with such intriguing company, it reminds me of simpler days, before certain tragedies altered the complexion of things. The warmth drained from the room like water from a tilted vessel. Lady Eugenia's mouth compressed. Sebastian's voice, when it came, was not raised. It did not need to be. Some memories are better left undisturbed, Carrington. Are they? He lifted the Murex ramosus, examining its spines with elaborate interest. I find the past has a way of resurfacing, like shells upon a shore. One might discard them, but a collector always recognizes value. It depends entirely on what one is willing to pay for rarity. The threat was elegant, unmistakable, and in the second that Cecily understood its full shape, that he knew that he had placed her at the center of it, that her presence in this house was the lever he intended to use, something went quiet and clear inside her. The quiet before an action, not a retreat. Sebastian took one step forward, contained and forceful. Carrington's smile slipped by a fraction. State your business, Sebastian said, a temporary embarrassment, a debt of honor, the sort of thing a man of your standing could resolve without inconvenience, alone. In return, my discretion remains absolute, and my recollections remain private. Cecily set down the Cypraea tigris. She stood. My lord? Her voice was clear and even. The Cornish lilt, which she had spent months smoothing away, she let through just enough. You have made your calculation. I wonder if you have made it correctly. She met his eyes, pale, sharp, unaccustomed to being held directly by a woman in muslin with calloused hands. A woman of my circumstance has very little to lose. The mathematics of reputation are rather different when one's name carries no ballast. You would use me as a stone to throw, but stones, my lord, can also be thrown back. The room held its breath. Carrington looked at her, then at Sebastian, whose expression was unreadable in the way of things that are, in fact, entirely legible to anyone paying attention. Then back at Cecily. "I shall call again," he said pleasantly, "when cooler heads prevail." He left. The door closed. Lady Eugenia exhaled with the finality of a woman delivering a verdict. Sebastian did not move. He was looking at Cecily with an expression she had not yet seen on his face, and she had been cataloguing his expressions the way Lady Eugenia catalogued her shells, carefully, with growing understanding of how rare the valuable ones were. "You should not have done that," he said. "No," she agreed. "Probably not." A silence. Then, very quietly, "It was without artifice." She said nothing. But she looked back at him and let him see that she knew exactly what he meant, that she accepted it, that she was not going to apologize for it. Carrington's letter arrived on a Friday. Sebastian brought it to Cecily in the garden himself. That told her more than the letter did. She was cutting the last roses from the wall, the ones that had held on past their season by sheer stubbornness. The shears were cold in her hands. The air smelled of turned earth and coming winter. He stood at the garden's edge and said, "You must leave." She did not set down the shears. "No. This is not open for discussion." "Everything is open for discussion," she said. "That is the nature of discussion." She turned to face him. He looked like a man who had spent a sleepless night arriving at a decision he had mistaken for resolution. "You made a contract. I am releasing you from it. The annuity—" "I am not talking about the annuity." She pulled off one glove and held it in her hand. "I am talking about the fact that every time something becomes difficult, your solution is to remove whoever is standing nearest to you. You did it with Elodie. Not the same way, not with the same intent, but the mechanism is the same. Push away, manage from a distance, preserve the surface." The muscle in his jaw moved. "You will not speak of Elodie." "I will speak of what is true," she said, not unkindly. "Because you asked me once, in the music room, whether I was playing a part. I said we both were. I was wrong. I am not anymore, and I think you are too exhausted to keep doing it either." The garden was very still. A late bee moved through the roses, indifferent to the weight of the air between them. "She was 19, he said. The words came out stripped of everything. No management, no armor, just the bare fact of it. "She came to me. She trusted me above everyone, and I told her the man had dishonored her, but that the family required a quiet resolution. I told her the scandal would be worse than the wound." He stopped. "I was wrong. I have been wrong about it every day for 3 years. Cecily said nothing. She let the silence hold him, the way you let a person rest their weight on something solid before asking them to walk again. "I have been paying debts," he said. "Every debt I could name, your mother's annuity, the village physician, the quiet arrangements, but there is one I cannot pay because she is gone, and you—" He stopped. His voice, recovering itself, was barely above the sound of the sea. "You make it harder to maintain the certainty that I deserve nothing beyond the accounting." 4 steps between them. Neither of them crossed it. "You do not deserve nothing," Cecily said. "That is not the same as saying the grief is wrong. The grief is right. It is the most honest thing about you." She held his gaze. "But grief and punishment are not the same thing. You have been treating them as if they were." He looked at her for a long moment. Then quietly, "Carrington will be managed, not with money." A pause. "With truth." "That," Cecily said softly, "is the bravest thing you have said since I arrived." The morning Sebastian met with Carrington, the sky over Brighton was the white of a page not yet written. He had not hidden. He had arranged the meeting formally. Carrington summoned to the villa at 11, Lady Eugenia present, a solicitor whose name carried 30 years of discreet consequence. Carrington arrived expecting a private negotiation. He found something that had been thought through with care and finality. Sebastian spoke for 12 minutes. He spoke of Elodie, not to protect her reputation in the way he had before, by locking it away and calling it mercy, but to restore it, to give it back to her. He named what had been done to her. He named the man responsible. He provided the solicitor with documents stored in a locked drawer for 3 years, while Sebastian had told himself that silence was a form of protection. He made it, in 12 minutes, no longer a secret that could be profitably whispered. Carrington sat very still throughout. He had the expression of a man watching a board reset itself in a game he thought he was winning. When Sebastian finished, Carrington looked at Cecily, once, briefly, as if only now calculating the variable he had failed to account for. Then he stood, straightened his coat and left without speaking. Lady Eugenia said, "That is the first sensible thing you have done in 3 years, Sebastian." She picked up her botanical illustrations and turned a page. That was, Cecily had come to understand, her manner of conveying that something significant had occurred, and she did not intend to make it uncomfortable by lingering. The afternoon came in warm and golden and carrying the smell of the sea. Cecily was in the garden, not working, simply sitting on the low stone bench with the last roses around her and the sound of the waves on the other side of the wall, steady and unhurried. A sparrow on the top of the wall went about its small, serious business. She heard his footsteps on the garden path. She had long since learned the sound of them, and today they were different, less armored, the step of a man who has set something down and has not yet decided how to carry himself without its weight. He sat beside her on the bench, not a calculated distance away. Simply beside her, the way people sit when they have stopped performing caution. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You owe me several." Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile. Near enough. "I intend to address them in order. I am, as you may have noticed, methodical." "I had noticed," she said. "I had also noticed that your methods occasionally require revision." This time, it reached his eyes. She had not seen it there before. This quality of light, this distinct warmth. The landscape of his face with it was so entirely, unexpectedly itself, that she had to look away for a moment to recover. "I saw you," he said after a pause, "that first night in the music room before you lit the candles." Her breath caught. "You were dancing." He was looking at the roses as he said it, the truth spoken at a slight angle, because facing it directly would make it too real to survive. "You did not know I was there. I should have withdrawn. I did not. I stood in the doorway and watched, and I have not been able to explain to myself why, except that I have never seen anyone so entirely themselves. No performance in it, no weight of what was expected, just movement and music, and someone who was, in that moment, completely free." Cecily looked at her hands in her lap. The warmth moved through her chest, slow and deep. "It frightened me," he said, "that such a thing still existed, that a person could be that and here in all of this without being destroyed by it." He stopped. His voice, when he recovered it, was careful and honest. "That I wanted to be near it, near you. Not because of the contract, not because of Carrington or Elodie or the machinery I had built, simply because you are yourself. And I had forgotten that a person could be that." The garden held the afternoon. The sparrow regarded them briefly, then departed on its own business. "I am not a solution," she said, "not a withdrawal, an honesty. I cannot repair grief or 3 years of solitude, or what remains with you about your sister." "No," he agreed. The word was quiet and without defense. "You are considerably more inconvenient than that." She looked at him then, and he was looking back. Nothing managed between them, nothing performed. Only the warm autumn air, the smell of the roses, and the sound of the sea going on as it always had. His hand rested on the bench between them. Open, not reaching, not demanding. Simply present, an offering placed quietly, to be accepted or left without condition. She looked at it, at the capable hand that had played a lament in a candle-lit room and told her more than all his words combined. Then she placed her hand over his. The garden went on around them, the roses and the wall and the sparrow returned to its stone, and the sea beyond going on and on. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left for words to do better than this. The warmth of his hand under hers, the afternoon light, and the slow, steadying certainty of having arrived somewhere real. Inside, Lady Eugenia turned a page without looking up and said, to the botanical illustration of a particularly fine passiflora with quiet and complete satisfaction. Finally, if this story moved you, if you have ever waited in a darkened room for someone to finally truly see you, leave a comment below and tell me where in the world you are watching from. Every voice matters. And if you are new here, subscribe. There are many more stories like this one waiting for you.
I was fading in a room without a name, just a shadow in a life that felt the same. Every heartbeat learned to whisper, not to scream. I was living somewhere in between. Then your silence touched my skin like a truth I couldn't hide. Something broke and something new came alive inside. In the quiet where you found me, I was dancing on my own. No one watching, no one waiting, just a heart made out of stone. But your eyes saw through the darkness, every piece I tried to hide. Now I'm breathing, now I'm breaking, now I'm finally alive. You were carrying a war I couldn't see. All the ghosts that never set you free. Every step you took was carefully controlled, but I felt the cracks beneath your soul.